He already knew how this was going to end. That was the problem. Kim Dokja had spent years reading Omniscient Reader's Viewpoint. Every arc, every twist, every death. He had memorized the survival strategies, the Constellation contracts, the hidden mechanics of a world that shouldn't exist. And now that world was real, and he was inside it, and the knowledge that had once made him feel like the one reader who truly understood the story was becoming the most dangerous thing he carried, because if anyone figured out what he knew, they would either follow him or kill him. And in a world where survival was already a wager made against gods who watched from above, being too obvious was its own kind of death sentence. He decided that morning that subtlety was over. Survival had to come first. The sheltered area where the survivors had gathered was running on borrowed time. Dokja could see it in the way people moved, in the arguments that flared up and died without resolution, in the way the stronger ones were already eyeing the weaker ones with calculations behind their eyes. He had read this part of the story. He knew what was coming, and he knew that the difference between living and dying in the next 24 hours would come down to whether anyone chose to actually use the system. Most of them were still afraid of it, still treating the blue status windows that floated in their peripheral vision like hallucinations they were waiting to wake up from. Dokja had no patience for that anymore. He opened his status window and read through the Constellation system for what felt like the 100th time. The rules were becoming clearer to him now, not from reading but from watching how the system responded to choice, to action, to intent. Constellations were entities of enormous power that existed above the human world, and they were watching. They watched the way an audience watches a story, hungry for drama, hungry for characters worth investing in, and they rewarded the ones who gave them what they wanted. Dokja understood audiences. He had been one his entire life. He made his move carefully, picking a moment when the group was distracted by an argument at the edge of camp. He stepped away from the others, found a quiet corner of the ruined building they were using as shelter, and began to speak. Not to anyone in the room, to the ones above it. His first Constellation contract was not glamorous. There were no angels, no thunder, no divine light. There was just a window that appeared, text that described the terms, and the particular kind of sick, nervous feeling that comes from making a deal you can't fully read the fine print on. He accepted. The system chimed. Something in the air around him changed in a way he couldn't describe. A weight that settled into his chest like a stone that had always been there and had finally decided to stay. He had made his first contract. The story had noticed him. He didn't let himself think too long about what that meant. The second shift came when he started using his knowledge openly enough to matter but quietly enough not to explain. He steered people away from the path that led past the collapsed overpass, the one where, according to the novel, a nest of lower-grade cursed entities was waiting in the dark. He suggested they take the longer route without explaining why. Most of them followed. Some of them resented it. The resentment was the first signal. One of the survivors, a man named Park Jong-hun, who had been a logistics manager before the apocalypse and had spent the 3 days since establishing himself as a de facto decision-maker, started watching Dokja differently after that. Not with suspicion exactly, but with the particular narrowed attention of someone who has noticed a pattern and is waiting to see it repeat. Dokja filed this away. In the novel, secondary characters who started noticing the protagonist's unusual knowledge had a way of becoming either allies or complications. He didn't yet know which category Park Jong-hun would fall into. What he didn't expect was Han Soo-young. She appeared on the 3rd day of their makeshift camp, slipping in from the East Road with a military-grade pack over one shoulder and the unmistakable energy of someone who had not spent 3 days panicking. She was calm in the specific way that very competent people are calm under pressure, not serene, not unaffected, but controlled, focused, calculating behind eyes that missed nothing. She introduced herself with a name and a question. The question was about the system, specifically about Constellation contracts, specifically about what happened to survivors who refused to engage with the system entirely, whether it was possible to survive outside the framework rather than inside it. It was, Dokja recognized instantly, exactly the kind of question someone would ask if they had already been thinking about the system for a long time and had arrived at a theory they were testing. He gave her a careful answer. She gave him a look that suggested she found his caution more interesting than his answer. Han Soo-young was going to be a problem. He had always known that from the novel. What he hadn't anticipated was that she was going to be his kind of problem, the kind that made you sharper by refusing to be simple. The first major battle came that afternoon. It announced itself the way most disasters do, with a sound that didn't fit, a shift in the quality of the air, the sudden collective stillness of people who have learned in 3 days to read silence as a warning. The creature came from the north, a mid-grade entity that the novel had placed in this district on exactly this timeline, and Dokja had known it was coming, and had spent the morning quietly positioning people where they needed to be without explaining why. The fight was brutal and short, and ended with 2 survivors with injuries that would slow them down, and 1 creature that would not trouble anyone again. Dokja had contributed more than he should have been able to for someone who looked like a man who had spent his entire adult life sitting at a desk reading on his phone. He caught a few looks after. He held them for a beat and then looked away. Park Jong-hoon didn't look away. "You knew where it was going to come from," the man said afterward. Not accusatory, observational. The tone of someone who had managed supply chains and knew what it looked like when someone had information others didn't. Dokja thought about lying. The lie was already forming. Something about hearing a sound, about a guess that happened to be right. But Han Soo-young was standing 8 feet away, and she was watching him with the specific attention of someone who already knew the lie was coming and was curious whether he would choose to tell it. He said something in the middle. Not the truth. Not a lie. Something that could become either, depending on what happened next. Han Soo-young's expression shifted by a fraction of a degree. It might have been the beginning of something. Respect, maybe. Or the beginning of suspicion. With her, Dokja suspected, those might be the same thing. He would have been fine with all of this. He had planned for most of it. What he had not planned for was the moment he sat alone that night, reviewing the trajectory of the day against what he remembered from the novel, and realized that something was wrong. The creature had come from the north. In the novel, it came from the east. A small detail, something that could be blamed on imperfect memory, on the difference between reading a story and living it, on 100 different reasonable explanations. But Dokja had read the novel more times than he could count. He knew that chapter. He knew where that creature came from. He sat in the dark with the gap between what he remembered and what had happened, and he felt something he had never felt before while reading. The cold, specific fear of a reader who realizes the story in front of them has started to diverge from the version they know. The novel was changing, or it had always been different, or something he had already done. Some choice, some action, some word spoken or not spoken, had bent the narrative in a direction the original text had never taken. Kim Dokja had read a story. He had memorized a map. But the territory was not the map. And somewhere in the gap between the two, something was already moving in a direction he couldn't see. Subscribe to Apex Recap for the full Omniscient Reader's Viewpoint recap series. Every chapter, every constellation, every twist you didn't see coming.